Hello, I'm Derek Walker. I'm the pastor of the Oxford Bible Church. We're in a series called Creation, Evolution, Revolution. And we're addressing the issue today, is evolution science? That's what we hear all the time, isn't it? And it can be very intimidating with all the voices in the world that says evolution's an established scientific fact. We're mocked if we question it. And I want to clarify the issue so we're not intimidated by that. We're going to consider this claim that evolution is science today. Yes, we're so impressed, aren't we, by the results of experimental science and technology that we would never question whether it was valid or not. And so if it was true that evolution was science, then we'd have to accept it, wouldn't we? But I want to explain that, in fact, evolution is not science, emphatically not. And I want to explain why, because I know that's a big claim. It's such a widely held view because it's said so much as if it's just assumed, it's so obvious that it's a fact. But I'm challenging that claim, and I want to give you proof that evolution is not science. Let's first of all talk about science. What is it? How does it work? As you know, science is meant to be an objective study of the nature of the universe, how it works, the laws of the universe. How do we do it? We do it through models and then experimentation, observation. By definition, science is limited to what we can observe and what we can test by experiment. We make a scientific hypothesis or a possible explanation for things, a model. And that's a model for how things work. And that must be testable and falsifiable. And so that model, it makes a prediction as to what should happen. And then we do an experiment, and if the prediction comes true, then we take that hypothesis more seriously. And if it continues to make good predictions, then we tend to accept it as a viable theory. And we keep that theory until something better comes along. And that's how science works. And gradually we get better and better theories as we do more and more experiments. Well, how does evolution compare to this scientific standard? And here I must make a shocking statement. Evolution has never actually been observed. So how can you call it science? What I'm talking about is molecules to man evolution, where life forms increase in complexity by themselves that has never actually been observed in real life, even on a tiny scale. So every time you're told about something evolving into something else, whether it's fish to amphibians, or amphibians to reptiles, or reptiles to mammals, or birds to dinosaurs, or monkeys to men, these are actually hypothetical stories. They're stated as fact, because they must be true if evolution is true, and apparently everyone knows that's true. But no, nothing of this nature, of one life form evolving into a higher life form, has ever been observed in real life. Evolutionists know that's true, but they explain that away by saying, well, we haven't had enough time to observe it because evolution happens too slowly. It takes millions of years. Fine, but please don't pretend that evolution is scientific fact when it manifestly is not. Now, you may be thinking that you have heard examples of evolution. You were told them at school. But I can guarantee you that all you were given were actually examples of natural selection, which is not the same as evolution. You were probably given a false impression that these were examples of evolution. Now, natural selection is a totally obvious process whereby animals with certain characteristics that help them survive in their environment and help make them more likely to mate and pass on their genes, and those characteristics, therefore, are passed on to the next generation. And so those better adapted to their environment are more successful passing on their genes. And as a result, those characteristics, whether it's skin color or beak length or whatever, those characteristics that are best adapted to the environment become more dominant in the population. Now, but that is not evolution. Evolution is something completely different. Evolution is the extraordinary claim that natural selection acting on mutations or copying errors, genetic abnormalities, over millions of years, that explains how that single-celled amoeba turns itself into a man. Lower forms of life becoming higher forms of life. Now that's never been observed, and it's somewhat unbelievable to my mind. But even if you believe it, please be honest, don't call it science. Now, not only is evolution not being seen happening in the present, there is no record of it ever happening in the past. You cannot see evolution in the fossil record. You see, if it did happen in the past, we should see it in the fossil record. If it were true, it should have left a trail of evidence in the fossil record showing how lower life forms changed themselves into higher forms over millions of years. There should be multiple thousands of intermediate forms, transitional forms, as each life form changed into another life form. You see, with all the changes that had to happen over millions of years, there should be lots of evidence of that, of evolution progressing. The fossil record should be filled with these transitional forms. Now, if we can see evolution happening in this way, then we would have to say, fair enough, it's science. But in fact, this was the main prediction of evolution. And this was therefore the best way we could test it as a real theory. Either it's false or it's true, because it makes predictions about the fossil record that are quite different from the predictions that creation would make. You see, it was a genuine test as well, because at the time of Darwin, the fossil record wasn't very well known. And any genuine scientific theory must be tested and able to be falsifiable. And Darwin himself realized that these transitional forms were the main test to see if his theory would be true. And now, enough time has passed, 150 years later, to be able to determine whether evolution has passed or failed that particular test, its main test. And there's no doubt that evolution has failed this test. In reality, there's a total lack of these intermediate forms. The evidence that should be there is missing, not only missing, but massively missing. We should have found thousands, hundreds of thousands of these transitional forms. And now the game is up on evolution, because our knowledge of the fossil record now is sufficiently complete to deduce there's a total wide-scale absence of the transitional forms that should be there if evolution were true. As one evolutionist said, 999 out of 1,000 frames of evolution are missing. And even that 1,000th frame is questionable, because it just refers to the odd, unusual, extinct find that, they would like to be a transitional form, but actually it's usually more easily interpreted as just a normal variation within a kind, not something on the way to becoming a higher kind. There's a late evolutionist, Dr. Patterson, admitted, he said, it's hard to contradict those who say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line, he said. There's not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Well, even if they found the odd, unusual fossil, the main message is clear. There's a sudden appearance in great variety of a number of different, highly complex forms, readily just there, without any sign of having gradually descended from other forms. They appear suddenly, and each major kind of creature appears suddenly with its characteristics complete in its full complexity. And that contradicts evolution, and that's exactly what creation predicts from the fossil record. There are no transitional forms there. Darwin knew that this was a major problem of his theory. He said, why then is there not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Notice that it wasn't just good enough to have the odd one, it should be full of them. Geology does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And that is the most obvious and serious objection that can be urged against the theory. And 150 years later, that's even more true. The problem is even greater. Darwin had hope that once people look for fossils, they'd begin to find these things. But actually, the opposite has happened. And so, evolution is a hypothesis, and more than that, it's a failed hypothesis. What kind of change do we actually see? Is it the change predicted by creation or by evolution? What does evolution predict? It predicts like a tree where everything is descended from one original creature. We should be able to see that in the fossil record. We don't. What does creation predict? That God made a number of different animals and caused them to multiply according to their kinds. And so in creation we expect to see variations of dogs, variations of cats and so on. Plenty of variation, but we do not see one kind changing into another. When we look at life, when we look at the fossil record, what we see is in accordance with the creation, not the evolutionary tree. Well, evolution is not observed in the present, it's not observed in the past, and we have to say there is no scientific evolution, no scientific evidence for evolution. It's not science, you see. Why do people believe it? Because if they reject it, then they have to believe in God, and they don't want to do that. So they believe it as an article of faith. Now, to cap this all off, Professor Steve Jones recently hit the news, a leading evolutionist and author, and he said, actually now, evolution has stopped. Human evolution has stopped. It's grinding to a halt, he said. He says because the conditions aren't right for it to happen anymore in the human race. And this is amazing to me, that we're expected to believe that evolution is a fact, even though it's never been observed in the past, it's never been observed in the present, and now apparently we're told it's not going to be observed in the future after. Give me a break. This would be amusing if it weren't so sad that so many people believe this propaganda. What about the so-called evidence for evolution? Recently I watched Richard Dawkins' program on TV called The Genius of Darwin, and that was his opportunity to not so much talk about Darwin a bit, but mostly it was about telling us about the wonders and the truth of evolution. So it was done to persuade us of evolution, and so I watched it because I thought, well, maybe I'll actually hear the solid evidence for evolution, because it's been evading me so far. And I was interested to see what evidence, because I knew he would no doubt bring forth the best evidence for evolution. And as to be expected, as always happens, on the program we got the mantra again, evolution's true, it's a fact. And there's loads of evidence to prove it. And anyone who questions it is stupid. That was the kind of message. But I did discern a few bits of evidence, 4 main lines of evidence, and I want to deal with those 4 main lines of evidence that you might face. And let's talk about that. Now, the first evidence is interesting that was put forward. Number 1, the similarity of life forms in many of their structures and in their DNA points to there being one evolutionary tree of life. For example, we have legs. Many different kinds of animals have legs. Insects have legs. Doesn't that imply that maybe we came from one original thing that developed legs? We all have eyes. Doesn't that mean we have a common ancestry? Particularly, Dawkins was impressed by the recent progress mapping the genome, with all the computers doing that, and the fact that we all living things have this molecule called DNA as our blueprint. And though some animals seem to be very different from others, much of their DNA is in common. Surely, he said, that is proof that we must have a common ancestry. But this isn't as impressive as it might seem, because this is also predicted by creation. You see, if there is one designer and one creator of all life, we would expect him to use a trademark uniformity of design to show that he is one creator. And we'd also expect great diversity as well within that unity. Just like a human painter or a designer can be recognized by his work. You know, that's a Picasso. He has many different kinds of paintings, but you can recognize his trademark. And this accounts for the universal use of DNA by God. You see, had God used 5 or 6 fundamental different ways of doing life, we might easily get the impression there are 6 gods here making the universe. They all had a part in it. That's what many of the ancient cultures believed in, polytheism. So if God is going to declare that he is one God, then he will make the universe as a universe with one set of laws and one fundamental blueprint for life. But he would also show his creativity by having so many variations within that unity, you see. But there has to be a fundamental unity, and God therefore used DNA for all life. And the amount of DNA that we share with other creatures is quite understandable because we share so many of the same physical processes as other animals. We need the same proteins, we need the same enzymes. So much of what we do is in common with them. And so naturally we will have a lot of DNA in common with them. So that's quite explainable in terms of design. So in other words, if there is a unity of design across life, there are 2 possible explanations. Number 1, common descent. We are all descended from the same original. Or, number 2, there's a common designer. We were all made by the same designer. We need to decide between the 2. Let me give you an illustration of this here. At our guest house, we have a number of table mats that all have a similar design. They all have pictures of different scenes from Oxford. Here's one from the Ashmolean Museum. Here's one from the Radcliffe Camera. And there's another one here that's Blenheim Palace, Magdalen Tower, and St Aldate's Street, and the Sheldonian Theatre. All of these look quite similar, don't they? But they're all different. They're all unique. One possibility is, originally, there was one form of mat. There was just one mat. All right? And then over the years, this original mat got copied and copied again. A copy was made from the copy, and so on. And each time a copy was made, there were slight differences. Maybe one of the lines on the drawing got deleted, or a new line got put in. And so gradually, over the generations, these small changes accumulated until Blenheim Palace changed into the Radcliffe Camera, you see. That would be one explanation of why all these mats kind of look similar, but yet they're all different. That they have a common descent from one original mat. But there's another explanation as well, isn't there? That probably sprung to your mind first. That there's a common designer, there's a common artist. And the similarities, therefore, don't mean that they all descended from one original, but it means that there's a common designer, a common creator. How could we tell which is true? If the mats have a common ancestry or a common creator? Well, if all the mats came from one original mat, do you know what would happen? We wouldn't just have these very specific pictures here. We would also have many transitional mats. Because as well as having this nice picture of Blenheim Palace, as it's changing into Radcliffe Camera, we're going to have many intermediate mats, aren't we? It would be kind of fuzzy because they'd have a bit of Blenheim Palace in them and they'd have a bit of the Radcliffe Camera in them, but they would all be messed up in the middle. In fact, there'd be thousands of mats in between these 2 mats. And so if we can find those transitional mats, then certainly we might deduce there's a clear connection. But if there's a total absence of them, I'm afraid the only obvious conclusion is that in fact they had a common creator. And all these transitional mats that don't exist are just a hypothetical story. And we can apply that logic, and I'm sure you applied that logic, and you came to the conclusion these mats were all made by one artist, one creator. Now apply the same logic to life forms, and you'll see that we have one creator, because there are no transitional forms, you see. God declares his glory through all the forms of life that he made. He made them of having one essential blueprint, DNA, but he also gave them great variety. He was showing that he is one, but yet he is creative. And so this is perfectly consistent with a single creator. Let me deal with the second line of evidence of creation, of evolution. And this is that evolution is sometimes claimed that new species are being created even every day, either through selective breeding, artificial selection, or natural selection. If populations get isolated, and then they can kind of become so different. And scientists then, once they become different enough, they label them as new species. And they imply this is evolution, but this is totally misleading. All they're doing is, if you inbreed an animal sufficiently, you'll create a kind of an inferior form, really. But anyway, they will not be able to mate with the original population. And so then scientists say, well, by definition, since they can't breed with the original population, we have a new species. But this has got nothing to do with upward evolution of one kind changing into a higher kind. It's actually they're actually devolving, they're becoming inferior. And we need to understand that the word species used by scientists today is not the same as the word kind, which the Bible uses. A biblical kind, for instance, the cat kind or the dog kind, includes many species within it. But what evolution is saying is that one kind can change into another kind. And the Bible and creation says no. There's much variation within the kind, but you can't ever produce a more advanced kind. And so evolution has not been observed. Species may be formed, but they are not evolutionary improvements. And in fact, that's impossible by the laws of information theory, that you can't have increasing complexity without someone actually adding information. It can't just happen by accident. Well, they've even tried to accelerate evolution through artificial selection, through inducing mutations by radiation and so forth. But what they've always found is they can create variation up to a limit, but you always hit that limit, that boundary, and that agrees with what the Bible says. Each thing must multiply according to its kind. And they've never been able to create change beyond that boundary. Never has an evolutionary change from one kind to a higher kind been observed. And all these attempts to inbreed and so on have only caused devolution, a loss of genetic information, not an increase. Now, the third one I want to deal with quickly is the issue of poor design. I mention this just briefly because we'll deal with this more later. But this argument used to be focused on vestigial organs, things like the appendix, organs that don't seem to be useful, and therefore we can explain them best by accidental byproducts of evolution. Why would God create the appendix when it has no use, in other words? But the list of vestigial organs has got shorter and shorter because gradually we've realized these things do have uses, including the appendix. It helps us deal with bacteria entering the intestines. Tonsils as well gives us resistance to throat infections. And so God, you see, these things actually do have uses. And also the Bible actually says that although God created everything good, the fall has happened and much degeneration has happened. So often there may be organs that have lost their use that God had originally given them because as the result of sin and mutations. So some species may actually have organs that have lost their main function. But that's not because God didn't make them in the beginning. It's because of the fall. And evolutionist Skedding said, vestigial organs provide no evidence for evolutionary theory. Now, recently though, this argument about bad design in nature has gone into what I consider a very foolish direction. Dawkins, in this program, and a friend of his, tried to explain how badly our eyes are designed. It couldn't be made by God, because It's just a bad design. They must have evolved, in other words. Now, I can't go into the details now of the human eye, but it should be clear to anyone how amazing and versatile our eyes are. We can see in 3D. We can see in all kinds of light. Close objects, distant objects. We can see to the stars. We can see nearby. We can see small and great. Nothing made by man, even so far, comes even close to what the eye can do. And so it seems foolish to me to use an argument like that, an object of such beauty and complexity, of flexibility, to make an argument against the Creator. How crazy is that? This evidence, I must say, for evolution is just not there. Actually, evolution is contradicted by the evidence. That's what I'm hoping you can see. It is not scientific fact. If you believe in evolution, fine. That's your choice. But please, be honest. Don't call it observed scientific fact when it is not.
Here is a selection of some of our CD series. Each contains 8 messages. These series give dynamic, in-depth teaching that will build your faith and increase your knowledge of God and His Word. You can find a full listing of these CD series on our website, www.oxfordbiblechurch.co.uk, or by contacting the church office. These are £20 each, but our special offer this month is buy any 2 and get the third free. You can order by telephoning 01865 515 086 or send a cheque to Oxford Bible Church, 363 Banbury Road, Oxford OX2 7PL.